For nearly 6 years, two scientists in northern Spain recorded crows around the clock, chasing a question that has followed humans for as long as we've watched birds gather in trees and call to each other across a field. What are they actually saying? The recorders ran continuously, the data piled up, and then it piled up so high that it became, in a very literal sense, impossible for two human researchers to listen to all of it. That's when they brought in artificial intelligence, not to translate crow language the way a phrasebook translates French, but to do something almost as difficult. Find the actual structure hiding inside tens of thousands of hours of birds calling to each other in a forest, structure no human ear could reliably sort through on its own. What came out the other side wasn't a crow dictionary. It was something more interesting and more honest than that. If you want the real story, verified against the actual published research and the scientists doing the work, rather than exaggerated for a headline, stick around, because what's actually happening in this research doesn't need any exaggeration at all. The scientists are Vittorio Baglione and Daniela Canestrari, both professors at the University of León in Spain, and this hasn't been a quick project for either of them. Understanding how crows talk to each other has been Baglione and Canestrari's mission for decades, long before any of the AI tools involved in this story existed. Stretching back well before machine learning was a serious option for handling this kind of biological fieldwork at all. Their subject is the carrion crow, a species that happens to be unusually interesting for exactly this kind of research, because of one specific behavior, cooperative breeding. Unlike most birds, where a single breeding pair raises their own chicks alone, carrion crows in this population raise their young as an extended family effort. Multiple adults, not just the two parents, participate directly in raising the chicks and defending the nest, staying on for one or more breeding seasons, as helpers rather than dispersing to start their own separate nests immediately. Which means the entire group needs a way to coordinate that goes well beyond what a simple mating pair would ever require. As Baglione put it directly, they have a VRI complex society, and they do very complex things together. It's really coordinated behavior, and researchers have already worked out why they do it. The evolutionary and social logic behind cooperative breeding is reasonably well understood at this point, tied to the survival advantages of raising chicks as a larger group rather than a single isolated pair. What Baglione and Canestrari actually wanted to know was how. How do multiple adult birds coordinate feeding, defense, and alarm behavior across an entire family group, moment to moment, using nothing but sound? To try to answer that, the two researchers deployed audio recorders and biologgers, small tracking devices that record movement and physical activity, out in the field in northern Spain, attaching some of them directly to individual birds and setting others up to continuously capture the ambient sound of entire crow territories, building a data set over years rather than weeks. The idea was straightforward in principle: record the calls, record the corresponding behavior at the same time, and start matching one to the other. In practice, it produced a problem that had nothing to do with birds at all, and everything to do with scale. Each individual microphone only lasted 6 to 7 days before its battery or storage needed to be swapped. But even in that short window, it captured far more audio than two human researchers could ever hope to listen through and label by hand. And that pattern repeated itself, recorder after recorder, season after season, for years. As Canestrari explained it plainly, they realized they actually had too much data to analyze. A problem that sounds almost like a good one to have, until you're the two people responsible for going through it, using nothing but their own ears and years of accumulated fieldwork experience. That data bottleneck is exactly why, starting in 2024, Baglione and Canestrari began collaborating with an organization called the Earth Species Project, a research nonprofit built specifically around this kind of problem. Earth Species Project, often shortened to ESP, was founded in 2017 by Britt Selvitelli, a member of the founding team at Twitter, and Asa Raskin, who helped found Mozilla Labs, later co-founded the Center for Humane Technology, and has spent years working on the broader question of how rapidly advancing technology affects human attention and behavior before turning his focus toward a very different kind of communication problem entirely. Katie Zakarian joined as a co-founder in 2020 and became the organization's CEO in 2022. The nonprofit's entire mission is built around a single idea: that modern machine learning, the same broad category of technology behind large language models and image recognition systems, could be pointed at the problem of animal communication specifically, not to produce a magic translator, but to help researchers actually process, categorize, and find structure in data sets that had simply become too large for any human team to handle manually. The organization has grown to roughly 25 people in total, including a dedicated AI research team of around 7 specialists, whose backgrounds span mathematics, neuroscience, deep learning, and natural language processing, a genuinely interdisciplinary group built specifically to tackle a problem that sits at the intersection of biology and modern computer science. In October 2024, The organization received $17 million in new grant funding, $10 million from investor Reid Hoffman's Aphorism Foundation, and a 3-year, $7 million pledge from the Waverly Street Foundation, a philanthropic effort funded by Laureen Powell Jobs. Funding the organization has been using specifically to expand its AI research team and its work with field scientists like Baglione and Canestrari, more than 5 times the organization's total expenses just the year before. For the Carrion Crow project specifically, ESP's research team helped build and apply tools designed to sort through exactly the kind of overwhelming audio archive Baglione and Canestrari had accumulated. One of the core tools involved is called Voxaboxen, a collaborative annotation platform built specifically for labeling and organizing animal vocalizations at a scale no human team could manage by listening alone. It's part of a broader suite of tools the organization has developed for this kind of work, alongside a self-supervised model called AVES, designed to analyze and classify animal vocalizations across many different species at once, and a separate denoising tool built to clean up messy field recordings without needing a perfectly clean training example to learn from first, since real-world audio captured in a forest is rarely as tidy as a studio recording. Rather than a single human sitting with headphones on for months, manually marking where each individual crow call starts and ends inside thousands of hours of raw audio, the model handles the initial detection and sorting work, letting the actual scientist focus on interpreting patterns rather than performing the mechanical labor of finding them in the first place. Applied to the Spanish crow recordings, the results were substantial by any measure. The technology helped researchers detect more than 127,000 individual crow vocalizations buried across their accumulated recordings, a scale of cataloging that simply would not have been realistic to complete by hand within any reasonable research timeline, let alone within the working lifetime of the 2 professors who started this project. The tool did more than just count calls, though. It helped distinguish between the vocalizations of adult crows and those of chicks, and separately helped filter out and identify calls belonging to other bird species that happened to be picked up in the same recordings, background noise that would otherwise have contaminated the dataset the researchers actually cared about and potentially skewed their conclusions without anyone noticing. Perhaps most usefully, the system helped solve a specific logistical headache that had been genuinely limiting the research, synchronizing recordings from multiple different loggers when several crows were calling back and forth at the same time. As Canestrari described it, in many of the territories they studied, there was more than one individual engaged in what amounted to a dialogue simultaneously, calls and responses overlapping from different birds picked up on. Different recording devices scattered across the same territory, lining those recordings up precisely so researchers could see exactly what one bird was physically doing at the exact moment another bird was calling, had been a serious technical bottleneck before, requiring painstaking manual cross-referencing between separate audio files, and it's precisely the kind of repetitive, detail-heavy synchronization task that machine learning tools handle far faster and more reliably than manual review ever could. Here's where it's worth pausing on what the research has actually found so far, because the honest answer, according to the scientists themselves, is that the analysis is still very much ongoing. This isn't a story with a completed, tidy conclusion, wrapped up neatly with a single headline finding, but one result has already emerged clearly enough to be worth sharing. Most crow vocalizations captured in this study turned out to be soft, low-amplitude murmurs, quiet sounds rather than the loud, far-carrying caws most people picture when they think of crow calls, the dramatic alarm calls that tend to dominate how the public imagines these birds communicating. According to the researchers, that pattern potentially indicates that a significant portion of crow communication happens at close range, between birds that are physically near each other, rather than being broadcast loudly across long distances the way an alarm call to a distant threat might be. That's a genuinely useful, concrete finding, the kind of detail that reshapes how researchers think about the basic structure of crow social life, suggesting that much of the actual coordination work happening inside these family groups is quiet, intimate, and easy to miss entirely if you're only listening for the loud calls. And it's a finding that emerged directly from being able to process an enormous volume of audio data systematically, rather than relying on whichever loud, dramatic calls happened to catch a human researcher's attention in the field. The next phase of the project is even more ambitious, and it's where the actual careful scientific goal of this work becomes clearest. Baglione and Canestrari are continuing to work with the Earth species. Project team to build what they've described as a kind of semantic map, a combined D dataset bringing together the audio recordings, video footage, and the movement data captured by those biologgers attached to individual birds, all synchronized together into a single unified picture of what's happening at any given moment across an entire crow territory. The goal, in Baglione's own words, is to match behaviors and calls together in order to give some real indication of the function of those Specific calls, essentially building call by call, an evidence-based picture of what different vocalizations are actually used for in the context of raising chicks, defending territory, and coordinating as an extended family group. That's a fundamentally different and considerably more rigorous goal than simply producing a list of crow words with English translations attached. It's closer to finally having the tools necessary to test decades of behavioral hypotheses against a genuinely complete data set, built from real recordings gathered over years of continuous fieldwork, rather than the small, hand-picked samples researchers were previously limited to working with due to the sheer manual effort required to process anything larger. It's also worth understanding that this crow research isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a broader pattern of the same underlying AI approach being applied to entirely different species facing entirely different research challenges. David Robinson, a senior AI research scientist at the Earth Species Project, framed the underlying motivation for all of this work simply. If you look at the biodiversity crisis currently unfolding globally, there's a significant, measurable disconnect between people and the natural world, and studying communication specifically can serve as a genuine window into the inner lives and behavioral complexity of other species, insight that can meaningfully inform conservation work, rather than remaining a purely academic curiosity. That same broad approach is currently being applied, using different but related tools, to a species about as far removed from crows as you can get within the animal kingdom: orcas. At the Raincoast Conservation Foundation in Canada, researchers are collaborating with the Earth Species Project to study the communication and behavioral patterns of orcas, animals that live in tight, long-term social groups and rely heavily on vocal calls to coordinate hunting and movement together as a pod, communication that has to travel effectively through an entirely different medium, water, compared to the open-air calls of crows in a Spanish forest. Valeria Vergara, co-director of Raincoast's Cetacean Conservation Research Program, explained that decoding those calls carries a direct conservation payoff, since it can shed real insight into how underwater noise, pollution from ships, and industrial activity affects the ability of these highly social animals to actually communicate with each other in their own habitat, a genuinely pressing conservation concern given how much commercial shipping traffic now passes through many of the coastal waters these animals depend on. As part of a pilot project, researchers there are combining drone footage with acoustic recordings to build a dataset linking specific orca vocalizations to specific behaviors and environmental conditions. Essentially, the same underlying strategy being applied to the crows in Spain, adapted for an entirely different species, an entirely different environment, and an entirely different set of recording challenges. Even before that larger dataset is fully built, the AI tools involved have already sped up a task that used to consume enormous amounts of researcher time. As Vergara described it, instead of a person having to sit and listen through every single minute of a recording manually, the tool can automatically pick out the actual vocalizations buried in hours of ambient ocean noise, so that researchers can then focus their limited time on examining and properly labeling just the relevant sounds rather than searching for them in the first place. The same technology has also proven useful for something less glamorous but genuinely practical: synchronizing the informal voice notes researchers record while out in the field with the corresponding whale audio or drone footage collected at the same moment. A basic organizational task that, according to Vergara, used to take months to properly sort through by hand, and can now be handled in about an hour. It's worth sitting with Vergara's own perspective on where this research should and shouldn't be heading, because it's a genuinely useful piece of scientific caution in a field that attracts an enormous amount of public excitement and occasionally overstatement that goes well beyond what the actual data supports. Vergara has been direct that the eventual, longer-term goal of this kind of research is to move beyond simply identifying different call types and dialects, and toward actually understanding the deeper meaning or function behind specific calls, much like what Baglione and Canestrari are attempting with their semantic mapping project for the crows. But she's equally direct in cautioning against the growing public fascination with the idea that AI might soon let humans directly communicate with animals in some kind of two-way conversation, an idea that tends to generate far more headlines than the actual, slower, more careful science supports at this stage. Her own preference, in her words, is to just be happy understanding whales on their own terms, without inserting ourselves into the conversation, a distinction that matters enormously for how this entire field of research should actually be understood and reported on, rather than flattened into a simpler, more dramatic story about machines finally learning to talk to animals. That caution applies just as directly to the crow research happening in Spain. What Baglioni, Canestrari, and the Earth Species Project team have actually built isn't a crow translator that lets a human type in a question and receive a crow's answer back in English. It's a set of tools that finally let researchers process an amount of real-world audio and behavioral data that had simply become too large for any team of humans to handle by listening alone. Tools that have already surfaced a genuinely new evidence-based finding about how close-range murmuring plays a bigger role in crow social life than the loud caws most people associate with these birds, and tools that are now being used to build a rigorous evidence-based map connecting specific sounds to specific behaviors, rather than guessing at meaning from a small handful of observed interactions, the way field researchers were often limited to doing in the past. That distinction matters, and it's worth being honest about it rather than reaching for the more dramatic framing. This isn't a story about scientists suddenly being able to have conversations with crows. It's a story about a genuinely difficult data problem. 6 years of dedicated fieldwork producing far more audio than any research team could realistically process by hand, finally being solved by tools built specifically for exactly that kind of large-scale pattern recognition. That solution is already producing real, useful, published findings about how these birds actually communicate day to day. And it's laying the groundwork for a considerably more ambitious project that aims to connect specific crow calls to their actual behavioral function, built on tens of thousands of real cataloged vocalizations, rather than a small cherry-picked sample. If you want to see what Baglioni and Canestrari's semantic mapping project reveals once it's further along, or how the same approach continues developing with the Orca research in Canada, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this is exactly the kind of quiet, methodical science that tends to produce its most interesting results only after the unglamorous data problem gets solved first.